Elderly woman rescued an injured bear. 2 days later, a litter of bear cubs shocked her. This outline captures the emotional journey of healing, love, and letting go, mirroring the touching style present in the inspirational files. Would you like any adjustments or additional scenes? Mrs. Martha sat alone in her small, cozy house on the edge of the forest, the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock the only sound breaking the evening silence. The flames in the fireplace dance, casting a warm golden glow across the room, illuminating the walls adorned with faded photographs and memories of a life once filled with laughter. She reached for her knitting needles, fingers moving methodically, yet her gaze drifted toward the window where the snow fell heavily, blanketing her rose garden in white. The garden was her sanctuary, the only remnant of her late husband's love and care. He had tended to those roses with unwavering devotion, their vibrant red blooms standing tall even in the harshest of winters. Martha spent her days there, pruning and nurturing each flower as if they were her children. It gave her purpose, a rhythm to her otherwise quiet life. But tonight the cold crept into the house, seeping through the old wooden windows, and an unsettling feeling weighed on her heart. She set her knitting aside, wrapping her frail body in a worn woolen shawl. She rose slowly, her joints aching from age and the lingering chill, and shuffled toward the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. Just as she set the kettle on the stove, a faint, pitiful whimper echoed through the night. Martha's heart skipped a beat, the sound so delicate that she wondered if it was merely the wind playing tricks on her ears. But then it came again, a soft, mournful cry carried by the icy breeze. She stood motionless, her breath caught in her throat. It sounded almost like a child weeping, fragile and filled with despair. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to retreat into the safety of her warm home, but the sound tugged at something deep within her, a familiar ache she thought she had buried long ago. She hesitated, her hand gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as memories of her daughter flooded back, the little girl whose laughter once echoed through these very halls. Shaking off the haunting thoughts, Martha wrapped herself tighter in her shawl and cautiously made her way to the front door. The cold was piercing as she opened the door, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Snowflakes danced furiously, swirling in chaotic patterns, and the garden lay shrouded under a heavy blanket of white. She squinted against the bitter wind, her eyes searching the shadows for the source of the sorrowful cry. Her heart raced, each beat echoing in her ears. She took a tentative step outside, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The cold air bit at her cheeks, turning them pink as she moved toward the far end of the garden, where the old apple tree stood, its gnarled branches heavy with snow. Her flashlight flickered as she approached, the beam of light trembling in her unsteady hand. Then she saw it. Martha's breath caught as the light fell upon a massive, dark shape lying motionless beneath the apple tree. At first, she thought it was a fallen log, but as she inched closer, the shape came into focus. A bear, its fur matted with snow and ice, its body curled into itself as if shielding from the brutal cold. She stumbled back, fear flooding her veins. A bear so close to her home, so near to where she stood trembling. Her instinct screamed at her to flee, to bolt inside and lock the door, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Her eyes were locked on the creature, unable to look away. The bear's chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, a stark contrast to the stillness of the night. Its leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, blood staining the snow beneath it, painting the white canvas with a cruel splash of red. Its eyes were closed, but a low, agonized moan escaped its mouth, the same mournful whimper that had drawn Martha outside. It was a sound of pain, of desperation. Martha's heart softened, a rush of empathy washing over her. She knew that kind of suffering, that helplessness. She had seen it before, in her daughter's eyes as illness stole her away, bit by bit. The memory hit her with the force of a winter gale, knocking the breath from her lungs. She took another step forward, her caution battling with compassion. The bear stirred, its eyes flickering open. Clouded and glazed with pain, they met Martha's gaze, locking onto hers with a look so raw, so vulnerable, that she nearly wept. It wasn't the look of a wild beast, but of a mother in agony. The bear let out another moan, a low, pleading sound that shattered Martha's fear. Her hands trembled as she instinctively reached out, then pulled back, unsure of what to do. Her mind raced with questions. How did it get here? What had happened to it? Was it dangerous? As she looked into those eyes, all her doubts faded. She saw herself reflected there, a mother who had lost everything, alone and afraid. Martha moved slowly, speaking in a soft, soothing voice, the same tone she once used to comfort her little girl during stormy nights. "It's okay. It's okay. I won't hurt you," she whispered, her words carried away by the wind. The bear's ears twitched, its body shivering with cold and pain. Martha noticed the way it curled protectively, shielding its belly. It was then she realized the truth. The bear was a mother. Her heart ached, the pieces falling into place. This creature had dragged itself to her garden, not for shelter alone, but for a safe place to protect its young. A surge of determination flared within Martha, igniting a long-forgotten strength. She couldn't abandon this mother, not when she knew the depths of that kind of love and loss. Without another thought, she turned and hurried back to the house, her movements fueled by urgency. She grabbed an old blanket, thick and warm, and a basin of warm water. Her hands shook as she rummaged through the medicine cabinet, collecting bandages and ointment. Steeling herself, she marched back into the freezing night, her breath visible in the frosty air. As she approached the bear again, she spoke softly, moving slowly to avoid startling it. The bear's eyes followed her, wary but weak, its body too exhausted to resist. Martha draped the blanket over its massive form, tucking it in carefully. The bear let out a soft groan, its body relaxing under the warmth. Martha knelt beside it, her fingers gentle as she cleaned the wound on its leg, whispering words of comfort. "You're safe now. I won't let anything hurt you," she murmured, her tears mingling with the snow. The bear's eyes softened, its breathing steadying as it surrendered to her care. Martha worked through the night, her fears replaced by compassion, her loneliness melting away as she sat vigil by the mother bear's side. She didn't understand why this had happened or what it meant, but as dawn's light crept over the snow-covered garden, Martha realized she was no longer alone. The morning sun crept over the snow-draped hills, its pale light filtering through the frost-covered window panes of Martha's cottage. Inside, warmth radiated from the crackling fireplace, a soft golden glow wrapping the room in a cocoon of comfort. Martha sat curled in her armchair, exhaustion weighing heavy on her eyelids, but she couldn't sleep. Her gaze remained fixed on the massive figure lying before the hearth, a mother bear, wrapped in an old woolen blanket, its chest rising and falling in steady rhythmic breaths. Its wound was cleaned and bandaged, the blood-stained snow now a distant memory. Martha's heart still raced when she thought about how close she had come to walking away last night, to shutting the door and pretending she hadn't heard the whimpering cries. But she knew she couldn't have done that, not after seeing the pain in the creature's eyes, a sorrow she understood too well. She remembered the way the bear had looked at her, helpless and pleading. It was the same look she had seen on her daughter's face in those final days, a look that had haunted her ever since. Her tired eyes drifted over the bear's body, marveling at its sheer size even as it lay wounded and vulnerable. Its fur was a deep, dark brown, now softened by the warmth of the fire, and Martha couldn't help but notice the elegance in its powerful form. Despite its exhaustion, the bear's posture remained protective, its body curled as if shielding something precious. Martha's chest tightened, an inexplicable feeling brewing inside her. What could drive a mother to drag herself to a stranger's garden, injured and broken? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint muffled sound, almost like a whine, high-pitched and trembling. Martha's heart skipped a beat. She leaned forward, straining to hear, but the sound vanished, swallowed by the crackling of the fire. She shook her head, chiding herself for letting fatigue play tricks on her mind. Yet just as she settled back, the sound came again, slightly louder this time, a pitiful, shivering cry. Martha's pulse quickened. Her eyes darted toward the bear, but it remained motionless, its breathing slow and even. She stood up, her joints stiff from the long night's vigil, and followed the sound, her feet moving almost instinctively toward the back door. A sharp gust of wind greeted her as she stepped outside, the snow crunching under her boots. She pulled her shawl tighter, shivering as the cold air bit at her skin. The morning was quiet, the world blanketed in white, the garden barely recognizable under the heavy snowfall. But the sound persisted, fragile and heartbreaking, echoing from the small wooden shed at the far end of the garden. Martha's breath caught in her throat, her steps quickening as she trudged through the snow, each cry slicing through her chest like a blade. Her hands shook as she reached for the shed's handle, hesitating for a moment before pushing the door open. The air inside was bitterly cold, the faint smell of wood and dust lingering in the shadows. Light seeped through the cracks in the walls, illuminating a huddled mass near the back corner, trembling and pressed tightly together. Martha's eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. 4 tiny bear cubs, their fur matted with snow, eyes wide with fear and confusion. They were impossibly small, their bodies no bigger than kittens, yet their cries were filled with a desperation that was all too familiar. They looked up at her, their little faces etched with vulnerability, and Martha felt her heart shatter. These were the mother bear's babies, abandoned and alone in the freezing cold, just as their mother had been. Her mind raced, piecing together the tragic puzzle. The injured mother bear had dragged herself to Martha's garden not to seek shelter for herself, but to find safety for her cubs. Overwhelmed by a surge of emotion, Martha fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she reached out, her fingers trembling. The smallest cub whimpered, its body shaking with cold, and instinctively, Martha scooped it up, cradling it against her chest. Its tiny form fit perfectly in her arms, its heartbeat rapid and faint. "Oh, you poor little things," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. She gathered the rest of the cubs, wrapping them in her shawl, her motherly instincts taking over as she hurried back to the cottage, shielding the fragile lives from the bitter wind. As she stumbled through the doorway, the warmth of the fire enveloped her, the sudden change in temperature making the cubs squirm. She quickly cleared a space by the hearth, laying them on a soft blanket and bundling them together to share warmth. They huddled close, their cries softening as the heat seeped into their frozen bodies. Martha's hands moved automatically, her mind racing as she fetched more blankets, warming milk on the stove, and feeding it to the cubs one by one with an old dropper she found in the cabinet. They were so small, so delicate, their eyes barely open, yet they drank eagerly, their tiny mouths desperate for nourishment. Martha's heart ached as she watched them, her tears falling freely. She had thought she would never feel this again. The fierce protectiveness, the need to nurture, to shield from pain. It was a feeling she thought had died with her daughter, buried deep under years of loneliness and grief. Yet here she was, caring for these orphaned cubs as if they were her own. Her gaze shifted to the mother bear, still lying by the fire, its body now visibly relaxed. Martha realized the bear must have heard the cries too, its instinct to protect keeping it alive through the cold night. She moved closer, her voice gentle as she spoke to the sleeping creature. "You did everything you could. You saved them," she whispered, her fingers lightly brushing against the bear's fur. It was softer than she expected, warm and surprisingly comforting. The bear stirred, its eyes fluttering open. For a moment, Martha froze, fear gripping her chest as those deep, dark eyes locked onto hers. But there was no malice in them, only gratitude. The bear's gaze softened, its body easing as it looked past Martha, its eyes resting on the cubs huddled by the fire. A low, rumbling sound escaped its throat. Not a growl, but a hum, a mother's call. The cubs responded instantly, their tiny bodies wriggling as they stumbled toward their mother, nestling against her belly. Martha watched, tears blurring her vision as the bear gently licked each cub, her massive form curled protectively around them. It was a scene of pure love, a bond that transcended species and circumstance. Martha's heart swelled, the warmth of the moment melting away the cold that had long settled in her soul. She realized she had been wrong. She wasn't saving them. They were saving her. Days passed in a gentle blur as Martha's once quiet cottage transformed into a haven of warmth and life. The mother bear, whom Martha began to call Willow for her resilience and grace, grew stronger with each sunrise. Her wound healed slowly, the swelling subsiding under Martha's careful attention and soothing balms. She no longer flinched when Martha approached, her eyes softening with trust. But it was the cubs that truly filled Martha's heart with light. They were a whirlwind of boundless energy and curiosity, stumbling clumsily across the wooden floor on their tiny paws, their round eyes wide with wonder. There were 4 of them, 2 boys and 2 girls, as Martha had discovered during one of her countless cuddle sessions by the fire. She had named them Birch, the boldest who always led the charge into mischief; Maple, the gentle one who watched with thoughtful eyes before trying anything new; Ash, the playful troublemaker who tumbled over everything in his path; and Fern, the smallest and quietest, always tucked close to Willow's side, seeking the comfort of her mother's fur. Martha spent her days caring for the little family, her every moment devoted to their needs. She found herself smiling more than she had in years, her laughter echoing through the rooms as the cubs tumbled and played, their tiny roars filling the house with joyful noise. They were fascinated by everything: the crackling fire, the softness of blankets, the way the light danced across the floor. Even the old grandfather clock became a source of endless curiosity, its rhythmic ticking mesmerizing the cubs as they sat in a line, heads tilted in unison. Each day was an adventure, a precious gift wrapped in fur and laughter. For the first time since losing her daughter, Martha felt truly alive. Yet beneath the joy, a shadow of worry lingered. She knew the bears couldn't stay forever. They were wild creatures, meant to roam the forests, to learn the ways of the earth. But the thought of letting them go, of returning to the cold emptiness that once haunted her home, filled Martha with a sorrow so deep it threatened to break her. She tried to push the thought aside, to live in the moment, but it clung to her, a silent whisper in the back of her mind. One morning, as the sun painted the snow in shades of gold, Martha sat by the window, watching the cubs wrestle by the fireplace. Willow watched too, her eyes filled with a mother's love, her body curled protectively around Fern. Martha felt a lump rise in her throat as she realized how much Willow trusted her, how the bear had allowed her cubs to play freely, knowing they were safe under Martha's roof. It was a bond Martha never thought possible, a bridge built from compassion and shared understanding. Her heart swelled, a bittersweet ache spreading through her chest. She couldn't imagine her life without them, without the sound of tiny paws scampering across the floor, without Willow's gentle hums as she watched over her young. Lost in thought, Martha was startled by a loud knock at the door. Her heart skipped, a cold dread seeping into her bones. She hadn't had visitors in years, not since the day they came to offer their hollow condolences after her daughter's funeral. Her hands trembled as she stood, the creak of the floorboards echoing through the suddenly silent room. The cubs stopped playing, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. Willow's body tensed, her muscles rippling under her thick fur, a low, warning growl rumbling in her chest. Martha moved quickly, placing herself between the door and the bears, her body instinctively shielding them. She opened the door just a crack, the cold wind slipping through the gap and biting at her cheeks. On her porch stood Henry Baker, a neighbor who lived half a mile down the road, his face flushed from the cold, his eyes wary. "Martha, everything all right?" he asked, his voice rough with suspicion. Martha's heart raced. Henry was a kind man, always polite in passing, but she knew his reputation as the town's biggest gossip. If he saw the bears, if he told the others, her mind spun, searching for an answer that would send him away without raising more questions. "Yes, Henry, just busy with some winter cleaning," she managed, her voice steady despite the panic twisting in her stomach. Henry squinted, his eyes narrowing as he peered past her shoulder. "Thought I heard noises, almost like growling. You sure everything's okay?" Martha's breath caught, her pulse pounding in her ears. She tightened her grip on the door, her knuckles turning white. "Just the wind howling through the old chimney," she lied, forcing a smile. "You know how this place creaks and groans in the cold." Henry didn't look convinced. His eyes flicked to the window, where a flicker of movement caught his attention. Martha's heart stopped. Birch's curious face appeared for a split second before vanishing behind the curtains. Henry's jaw dropped, his eyes wide with shock. "Was that a bear?" he stammered, stepping back. "Martha, what in God's name is going on?" Martha's world spun, her mind screaming with fear. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off as a trick of the light. But she saw the fear in Henry's eyes, the way his body tensed as if ready to flee. She knew lying was useless. Her shoulders sagged, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She opened the door wider, her face pleading. "Henry, please, listen to me. They're not dangerous. They're just babies, orphans. I found their mother, wounded, dying in the snow. She came to my garden to save them. I couldn't turn them away." Her voice broke, the raw emotion spilling out before she could stop it. Henry's face softened, his eyes flicking between Martha's tear-filled gaze and the shadows inside her cottage. He shook his head, disbelief mingling with concern. "Martha, you know what people will say. They'll want the bears gone. They'll call animal control. Hunters." The words were a knife to Martha's heart, the thought of losing them more than she could bear. "Please, Henry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're all I have. Please don't tell anyone. Let me keep them, just until they're strong enough to survive on their own." Henry looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the depth of her loneliness, the aching void these bears had filled. His shoulders sagged, his face softening. "All right, Martha," he sighed, his voice gentle. "I won't say a word, but be careful. If the wrong people find out—" Martha nodded, gratitude flooding her chest. Thank you, Henry." As he walked away, his figure growing smaller against the snow-covered landscape, Martha closed the door, her body sinking against the wood as relief washed over her. She turned to see Willow watching her, those wise eyes gleaming with gratitude. Martha's heart tightened. She knew their time together was borrowed, that one day she would have to say goodbye. But not today. Today they were still a family, and she would fight to keep it that way for as long as she could. Winter's icy grip tightened around the forest, its snow-laden branches bending under the weight of frost. But inside Martha's cottage, warmth and love thrived. The fireplace crackled cheerfully, casting a golden glow that danced across the room as the bear cubs played on the worn rug. Birch and Ash wrestled playfully, their tiny growls echoing with fierce determination, while Maple watched with wise eyes, occasionally swatting at her brothers when their antics grew too rowdy. Little Fern nestled close to Willow, content to snuggle into her mother's fur and observe the chaos from a safe distance. Martha watched from her rocking chair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she created little blankets from scraps of yarn. She smiled, her heart swelling with a joy she hadn't known in years. It was a miracle how these creatures had filled her home with life, how their presence had chased away the loneliness that once echoed in every corner. Each day they grew stronger, their once fragile bodies now sturdy and full of energy, their playful roars filling the house with laughter. Willow had recovered remarkably under Martha's care. Her leg, once swollen and torn, had healed into a jagged scar, a testament to her strength and the journey that had brought her to Martha's garden. Her eyes, once clouded with pain, now sparkled with vitality and gratitude. She followed Martha around the house, a quiet guardian, watching with gentle curiosity as Martha went about her daily chores. The bond between them had deepened, an unspoken trust that grew stronger with every shared glance, every soft word. Martha often found herself talking to Willow, sharing her thoughts as she would with an old friend, telling stories of her late husband and daughter, of the laughter that once filled these walls. Willow listened, her wise eyes filled with understanding, her massive head resting on Martha's lap as if offering comfort. It was as though she understood the sorrow hidden beneath Martha's smile, the loss that lingered in her heart. In return, Martha cared for Willow and her cubs with a mother's love, finding healing in the warmth of their little family. But despite the joy that filled the cottage, Martha knew their time together was fragile. The snow outside was beginning to melt, the first signs of spring appearing as tiny green shoots peeked through the frosted ground. Soon the forest would call to Willow and her cubs, a whisper of freedom and wild instinct. Martha's heart ached at the thought, the idea of letting them go piercing her soul with a pain she wasn't ready to face. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the present, to cherish every moment of laughter and love. Yet the truth loomed over her, a shadow she couldn't outrun. They were not hers to keep, no matter how deeply she loved them. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the snow into sparkling droplets, Martha sat on the porch, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. Willow lay beside her, her massive body relaxed, her golden eyes gazing out at the forest. The cubs tumbled playfully in the snow, their joyful roars echoing through the trees. Birch led the charge, his bold spirit driving him to explore every nook and cranny of the garden. Maple followed close behind, her cautious nature tempered by curiosity. Ash tackled a snowdrift, sending a flurry of powder flying, while Little Fern watched with wide eyes, content to observe from a distance. Martha's heart swelled as she watched them, the warmth of love and pride filling her chest. Beneath the joy, fear gnawed at her, an unspoken dread that she tried to bury. What would happen to them once they returned to the wild? Would they be safe? Would they remember her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of crunching snow. Martha's body tensed, her heart leaping to her throat as she turned to see Henry standing at the edge of her garden, his face pale with worry. "Martha!" he called, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to talk." She rose slowly, her body trembling as she approached him, her eyes never leaving his face. "What is it, Henry?" she asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her. He glanced nervously at the bears, his shoulders sagging as he sighed. "Word's gotten out. Some hunters are coming this way. Said they heard about a mother bear with cubs near town. They're looking to make a trophy out of her." Martha's blood ran cold, the world spinning around her as fear wrapped its icy fingers around her heart. She looked back at Willow, who was watching them with calm, trusting eyes, unaware of the danger closing in. The cubs continued to play, oblivious to the threat that loomed just beyond the trees. Martha's body shook with rage, her fists clenching as tears stung her eyes. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. "No, I won't let them take her. I won't let them hurt them." Henry placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his face etched with sympathy. "I know, Martha, but you need to be smart about this. You can't hide them here forever. It's not safe." His words cut deep, the truth crashing down on her like a wave. She knew he was right. The bears couldn't stay. It wasn't just about safety anymore. It was about survival. Her home, once a sanctuary, had become a trap, and the only way to protect them was to let them go. Martha felt her heart break, the pain of loss searing through her chest. She looked at Willow, at the cubs who had brought laughter back into her life, who had given her hope and love when she thought she had none left to give. How could she say goodbye? How could she let them go, knowing she might never see them again? Yet as she watched Willow nuzzle Fern, her body curling protectively around her cubs, Martha understood. They belonged to the forest, to the wild that called to them. Her love had saved them, but it couldn't keep them. She had to be strong for their sake. Wiping her tears, Martha turned to Henry, her voice firm. "Help me, Henry. Help me get them back to where they belong." Henry nodded, respect shining in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes." Together, they made a plan, a way to lead Willow and her cubs safely into the heart of the forest, far from the hunter's reach. It would be risky, but it was their only chance. Martha spent the night preparing, gathering supplies and holding the cubs close, whispering words of love and farewell as they drifted off to sleep. Willow watched her with knowing eyes, a quiet understanding passing between them. When dawn broke, Martha stood at the edge of her garden, watching as Willow led her cubs into the trees, their silhouettes fading into the morning mist. She stayed there long after they disappeared, tears streaming down her face as her heart shattered. The cottage felt empty, hollow without their laughter. But as the sun rose higher, warmth flooded her chest, a sense of peace settling over her. She had given them a second chance. She had saved them. And in doing so, they had saved her too. Martha stood at the edge of her garden long after Willow and her cubs disappeared into the forest, her heart aching with a hollow emptiness. The morning mist clung to the trees, their branches swaying gently as if whispering their farewells. She strained her eyes, hoping to catch one last glimpse, one final flash of brown fur. But the forest held its secrets, wrapping the little family in its vast, ancient embrace. Her chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat as the realization sank in. They were gone, truly gone. She would never again hear the playful growls echoing through her cottage, never feel the tiny paws scrambling across her floor, or see Willow's wise eyes watching her with quiet understanding. The house would be silent once more, a hollow echo of what it had been. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of the loss, tears slipping down her weathered cheeks as she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces of her breaking heart together. It was as if she were losing her daughter all over again, the pain just as sharp, just as merciless. She wanted to scream, to call out to Willow, to beg her to come back, but the words died on her lips, lost in the cold morning air. Henry's voice broke through the silence, gentle and heavy with sympathy. "You did the right thing, Martha. You gave them a chance to survive, a chance to live the life they were meant to live." She turned to face him, wiping her tears with trembling hands. I know it was the right thing, but why does it hurt so much?" Henry's face softened, his own eyes glistening. "Because love always does. But that love also saved them. You gave them hope. You gave them a future." Martha nodded, her heart heavy with grief and gratitude. She looked back at the forest, a soft breeze rustling through the trees, the sun breaking through the clouds to bathe the world in golden light. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs, and let it out slowly, releasing the pain as best as she could. She knew she couldn't stand here forever, waiting for them to return. They were where they belonged now, wild and free. It was time for her to find a way to live without them. The days that followed were painfully quiet. The cottage felt empty, too still, as if the walls were mourning with her. She moved through her routines in a daze, her hands going through the motions without thought. Everything reminded her of them: the blankets by the fire where they used to sleep, the corner of the room where Birch and Ash had wrestled, the kitchen floor where she had spilled milk while feeding them, and they had lapped it up with joyful little snorts. Her heart ached with each memory, her chest tightening until she could barely breathe. She found herself lingering by the window, her eyes tracing the tree line, hoping for a glimpse of familiar faces. But the forest remained silent, offering no comfort, no sign of the family she had loved and lost. At night she would lie awake, straining to hear the soft hums Willow used to make as she watched over her cubs. But all she heard was the wind whispering through the branches, its mournful call echoing her own sorrow. Martha began spending more time in the garden, tending to the roses with a fervor that bordered on desperation. She dug her hands into the earth, feeling the cool soil beneath her fingers, grounding herself in its solidity. She pruned and watered, whispered to the blossoms, and begged them to bloom, to fill her world with color and life again. Yet no matter how hard she worked, the emptiness remained. The garden was just as silent as the house, the laughter and joy she had known now a distant memory. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the snow melted, revealing the earth beneath, rich and ready for growth. Tiny green shoots began to peek through the frost, the first signs of rebirth. Martha watched them with weary eyes, her heart yearning for something she couldn't name. She felt like those fragile buds, fighting to break free from the cold ground, reaching for light but trapped in darkness. She missed them, missed the warmth of their fur, the feel of their tiny bodies curled against her lap, the love that had filled her home. She missed Willow's eyes, those wise, ancient eyes that had looked at her with gratitude and trust. Most of all, she missed the way they had healed her, their presence stitching together the wounds she thought would never mend. One afternoon, as she stood by the apple tree where she had first found Willow, Martha closed her eyes, letting the breeze wrap around her. She could almost hear them, the cub's playful growls, Willow's soft hums. Her chest tightened, a wave of longing washing over her. She placed her hand on the tree's rough bark, her fingers tracing the grooves, grounding herself in its strength. "I miss you," she whispered, her voice breaking. I hope you're safe. I hope you're happy." A rustling sound broke the stillness, soft and hesitant. Martha's eyes flew open, her heart leaping as she turned toward the noise. Her breath caught, her body freezing as she saw them. 4 tiny faces peeking from behind a snow-covered bush, their eyes wide and curious. Birch stepped forward first, bold as ever, his little head tilted in playful defiance. Ash and Maple followed, tumbling over each other, their mischievous grins lighting up their faces. And there at the back, shy and cautious, stood Fern, her eyes locking onto Martha's with a look of recognition so deep, so pure, that Martha felt her heart shatter all over again. Tears blurred her vision as she stumbled forward, her hands trembling. You came back," she choked, her voice shaking with disbelief and joy. The cubs hesitated, their eyes flicking to the trees, and Martha's heart sank, knowing what that meant. She looked up, her gaze searching the shadows until she saw her. Willow, standing tall and majestic at the edge of the clearing, her golden eyes watching with quiet affection. They stared at each other for a long moment, an understanding passing between them, a promise kept. Willow gave a low, rumbling hum, her body relaxed, her gaze soft. She nudged Birch gently, urging him forward, her eyes never leaving Martha's. The cubs ran to her, their little bodies colliding against her legs, their paws batting playfully at her skirt. Martha dropped to her knees, laughing through her tears as she wrapped her arms around them, her heart swelling with love. Willow watched for a moment longer, her eyes shining with gratitude, before turning and slipping back into the shadows, her silhouette fading into the forest. Martha held the cubs close, her tears falling onto their fur as they nuzzled against her. She knew Willow was gone, that this was goodbye, but they had come back to her, even if just for a moment. She closed her eyes, her heart full, the emptiness finally fading. She wasn't alone, not anymore. She never would be again. Spring burst into full bloom around Martha's cottage, the once frozen ground now carpeted with wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. The rose garden thrived under her loving care, vibrant red petals unfurling toward the sun, their delicate fragrance weaving through the warm air. Yet even amid the beauty of the season, Martha's heart was heavy with bittersweet joy. It had been weeks since Willow and her cubs returned that fateful afternoon, a fleeting reunion that felt like a dream. She could still feel their tiny paws pressing against her, their playful roars echoing in her ears. But the forest had called them back, and she knew they were gone for good this time, reclaiming the wildness that was rightfully theirs. Yet the pain was softer now, edged with hope instead of despair. They had returned to her, even if just to say goodbye. They remembered her, loved her, and that was enough. Martha kept busy tending to the garden, her hands working the soil with care, her heart healing alongside the blossoms. She no longer watched the tree line with desperate longing, though her eyes would sometimes linger, a wistful smile gracing her lips as she imagined Birch and Ash wrestling in the shadows, Maple watching with thoughtful eyes, and little Fern snuggled safely beside her mother. She found herself talking to them as she worked, her words drifting into the breeze, carried to the forest beyond. "I hope you're causing trouble, Birch. And you, Fern, I hope you're brave. Just a little, for me." She would laugh softly, shaking her head at her own foolishness, but her heart would feel lighter, the world less empty. Her days were no longer hollow, her life no longer burdened by grief. The ache of losing her daughter remained, a scar that would never fully heal, but she had learned to live with it, to carry it alongside her love for Willow and her cubs. One golden afternoon, as Martha was pruning the roses, she heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the path. She turned, shielding her eyes from the sun, to see Henry approaching, his face beaming with excitement. "Martha!" he called, his voice bright with anticipation. "You need to come with me. There's something you've got to see." Martha wiped her hands on her apron, curiosity stirring in her chest. "What's got you all worked up, Henry? You're grinning like a fool." Henry just laughed, his eyes sparkling. "Just trust me. Bring your coat. It's a bit of a walk." Martha hesitated, glancing at the garden, but Henry's enthusiasm was contagious. She grabbed her shawl and followed him, her heart pounding with a strange mix of excitement and fear. He led her down a winding trail through the woods, the sunlight filtering through the branches, dappling the earth with patterns of gold. Birds sang in the treetops, the world alive with the joy of spring. Martha's heart raced as they walked deeper into the forest, memories flooding back. Willow's wise eyes, the cubs' playful growls, the warmth of their fur. Her hands trembled, and she clutched her shawl tighter, bracing herself against the wave of emotion. Finally, they reached a clearing, the trees parting to reveal a sunlit meadow surrounded by wildflowers. Henry stopped, his face softening, his voice a whisper. "Look there, just by the riverbank." Martha followed his gaze, her breath catching as she saw them. Willow and her cubs playing by the water's edge, their fur shining under the sun. They looked healthy and strong, their bodies sleek with muscle, their movements full of life. Birch and ash wrestled near the riverbank, their roars echoing through the clearing as they tumbled over each other, playful and fierce. Maple stood nearby, her head tilted thoughtfully as she watched her brother's antics, her calm presence grounding them even from a distance. And there, nestled close to Willow's side, was Fern, her little body curled against her mother's fur, safe and protected. Willow lay with her head resting on her paws, her golden eyes watching her cubs with love and pride. Her body relaxed, content. Martha's heart swelled, tears filling her eyes as she took in the sight. They were beautiful, wild, and free, just as they were meant to be. If sensing her presence, Willow's head lifted, her eyes locking onto Martha's. Time stood still as they stared at each other, 1,000 words passing between them without a single sound. Gratitude, love, farewell. Martha's tears spilled over, her body trembling as she lifted her hand, a silent wave, her fingers brushing the air. Willow's eyes softened, her body relaxing as she let out a low, rumbling hum, the sound carrying across the meadow. A mother's call of comfort and love. The cubs looked up, their heads turning in unison, their eyes widening as they saw Martha standing at the edge of the clearing. Birch tilted his head, his curious gaze lighting up with recognition. He took a step forward, his body leaning toward her, a little growl of excitement escaping his mouth. But Willow placed a gentle paw on his back, holding him in place, her eyes never leaving Martha's. The message was clear. It was time to let go. Martha's heart broke, the pain sharp and deep, but she nodded, understanding Willow's wish. They belonged here, in the wild, in the world they were born to explore. She had given them love, safety, and strength, but the forest would give them freedom. It was where they were meant to be, and she would not stand in the way. She wiped her tears, her face breaking into a smile, her heart swelling with pride as she whispered, "Goodbye, my darlings. Live well, be brave, be happy." Willow watched her for a moment longer, her eyes shining with gratitude, before turning away, her body moving gracefully as she nudged Fern forward, leading her cubs toward the riverbank. They moved as a family, wild and untamed, their silhouettes bathed in sunlight, their playful roars echoing through the clearing as they disappeared into the forest. Martha stood there long after they were gone, her heart aching but full, her soul at peace. She knew she would never see them again, but she would carry them with her always, their love imprinted on her heart, their laughter lingering in the walls of her cottage. As she turned to leave, the breeze rustled through the wildflowers, carrying with it a familiar hum, soft and gentle, a mother's lullaby. Martha closed her eyes, her tears falling freely as she smiled, the wind wrapping around her like an embrace. She walked home slowly, her body light, her heart whole. Her cottage awaited her, warm and welcoming, the garden bursting with life. She stood at the gate, her eyes drifting to the forest one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried by the wind, "for saving me." She turned toward the house, her steps steady, her spirit free, ready to face the world with hope and love. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Martha knew she would never truly be alone again. This heartwarming story reminds us of the power of love, compassion, and letting go. Through Martha's journey, we learn that healing often comes from the most unexpected places. By opening her heart to those in need, she not only saved Willow and her cubs, but also found the strength to heal her own wounds. The bonds we create with others, even those who are only meant to be in our lives for a short while, can leave a lasting impact, teaching us courage, resilience, and the beauty of selfless love. This story beautifully illustrates that sometimes love means letting go, trusting that what we've given will carry on in the hearts of those we've touched. It's a powerful reminder that every act of kindness, no matter how small, can change a life, including our own. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel for more inspiring tales of hope and love. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment about what this story meant to you. Your support helps us continue to bring you these beautiful stories. See you next time.